and their sanctuaries were places of religious pilgrimage. So Mecca was a pilgrimage site in addition to a trade city. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the traditional view is that there also were some monotheists who were living here called Hanifs. This means a revert, and it refers to someone who, according to Islamic belief, maintained the pure monotheism of Abraham. And the traditional Muslim view is also that Abraham visited Mecca and helped build the Kaaba along with Ishmael, and he preached a monotheism that some people still held to by the time Muhammad appears. More specifically in Islamic thought, Hanifs are the people who, during the period known as the pre-Islamic period or the Age of Ignorance, were seen to have rejected idolatry and retained some or all of the tenets of the religion of Abraham. But in pre-Islamic tribal life, monotheism that rejected all other gods was not considered good. Gods accumulated as tribes came in contact with each other, and tribesmen would pray to whomever they needed help from at the moment. You didn't want to exclude any gods for fear of getting their wrath. And this period is considered by Muslims to be the period of ignorance, or Jahiliyyah. The term applies to the period preceding Muhammad's prophetic career, but it's also used loosely to denote the entire span of Arabian history before that time. Tribespeople were considered primitive in their politics and their religion, and they thought that caves and trees and springs and stones were the abode of spirits. It was also said that they did such practices as the killing of infant girls and sacrificed children, much in the way that the Old Testament describes the Canaanites. Early Islamic sources say that before the appearance of Muhammad, Arabs would practice infanticide as a means for the prevention of poverty and considered to be the solution for the liability of a female child. So the practice, they said, was to bury the infant alive so that no blood was shed, because bloodshed was part of the legal definition of murder in this tribal society. All right, so that's the traditional view of what pre-Islamic Arabia was like. Here's what other scholars have been putting together. This is a different picture they're painting. And a lot of the information I have comes from a book by Jonathan Berkey called On the Origins of Islam. This is a book that if you take a 200 or 300 level history course at a university about the Middle East, you're probably going to come across this book. I think it's a great introduction. So if you want a more scholarly exposure to Islamic civilization that doesn't get too far into the deep end, I recommend this book. So let's take a closer look at the Ghassanid kingdom. The Ghassanids were this tribal group that the Byzantines paid protection money to guard the Byzantine border on northern Arabia and keep Persians or other people from coming in. The Ghassanid kingdom straddled the Roman and Arabian worlds. Its rulers were Arabs, and they shared with the Bedouins the culture of poetry that loomed largely in pre-Islamic Arabian culture. By the first half of the 6th century, they had largely converted to Christianity, so they were Christian Arabs. The Ghassanids contributed to the Christianization of Arabia. They supported missions there, particularly to the south of the peninsula, to cities such as the Najran. So that's why in the Quran you have references to Christians and Jews, people of the book, because they were Christians by this point in southern Arabia. But their Christianity was different from the type that was supported by the Byzantine Empire. They were monophysites, which is a term relating to what they believed the nature of Christ to be, and I won't get into that, while Byzantine emperors were Chalcedonians. There were different ecumenical councils that called monophysites heretics, so Arab Christians wouldn't have been in the good graces of a Byzantine bishop. The Ghassanids were federated allies of Rome, or Byzantium, depending on what you want to call them in the 500s and 600s, and they served Byzantine interests in Arabia and on the frontier with Persia. The tensions grew worse, and on the eve of the Muslim conquests, according to chronicler Theophanes, a Roman official in Palestine, dismissed Arab soldiers who wanted their pay and drove them away and insulted them as dogs. Now, the Byzantine emperors did want to draw the Arabs into their fold. Constantius, for example, in the 4th century sent a bishop to convert the South Arabs. His mission wasn't a great success, but it also shows the complex intersection of religion and politics and commercial interests in Arabia, because the region was known to the Romans, in part through the activities of merchants there, and also because they wanted a strong foothold there so that Persia didn't extend its influence into the Arabian Peninsula. One indication of this interest is found in a story recorded by the Muslim historian al-Tabari, and he says that Byzantine artists and stonemasons and mosaic artists helped to construct a church in Yemen out of marble and with mosaics sent from Constantinople. So in late antiquity, in the 500s and 600s, Arabia was a center of religious competition, and the Byzantines played this game to the best of their ability. But the Arabs seem to have consciously avoided the specifically imperial version of the Christian faith, or Chalcedonian faith. So with Christian Arabs already marginalized by Byzantium, they were ripe for conversion to Islam when it appeared, and there were many Christian Arabs who did not convert to Islam, because as long as you paid a poll tax to Muslim rulers, for the most part there wasn't compulsion to convert, and since they didn't have that strong of imperial loyalties to Byzantium anyway, why not join a new empire that seems to be accumulating a lot of wealth and winning military victories? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. All right, so let's jump to the early 7th century with the rise of Islam. Virtually all accounts of the rise of an Islamic state and then an empire in the 7th century stress just how extraordinary it is. Marshall Hodgson referred to it as a breach in cultural continuity unparalleled among the great civilizations. So how did it all happen? The most spectacular development in the decades before the Muslim conquests was the brutal series of wars between the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Persian Sasanian Emperor Khusro II apparently wanted to restore the Persian hegemony over the whole of the Near East, which Iran held under Cyrus and Xerxes. And he came pretty close to success. By 620, Persian armies occupied Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, all the way up to Constantinople. But the Byzantine Empire was able to stage a remarkable comeback led by Emperor Heraclius, and he restored the Asian provinces and Egypt to Byzantine rule. He even invaded Iran and plundered the royal palace. But all that to say, it left the Near East completely devastated. And there was also political instability happening at the same time. Heraclius came to power on the wings of a coup against the ineffective Byzantine military tyrant Phocas. And on the Persian side, the sacking of the Persian palace led to the murder of Khusro in 628. And archaeological evidence shows that at some point in the early or mid-6th century, when the plague was going on that I talked about earlier, cities such as Antioch and Aleppo experienced economic decline and depopulation and a contraction of the civic space and life that supported a flourishing urban culture in late antiquity. The decline also affected Roman defenses on the southern desert frontier, or northern Arabia. Forts were abandoned, to be occupied in some cases by solitary monks, and security was turned over to nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes like the Ghassanids that had tentative alliances with the Roman authorities. So a lot to say, when we talk about Muslim conquests, they might not have been conquering these desert fortifications. They might have just shown up and found them to be empty and just waltzed in and took it over. So against the backdrop of what's happening here, different religious groups in the Near East are also becoming more sharply differentiated. We see more religious polemics being written between Christians and Jews, and they're becoming more heated. Also, with the wars against Persia, which was Zoroastrian before the rise of Islam, Christian identity becomes more enveloping to a Byzantine. So the religious sphere had expanded to absorb almost everything, and in particular an individual's identity. This wasn't like the Roman period where your religious identity was more separate from your civic identity. What civic life remained in Byzantine cities in the 6th and 7th centuries was overseen by the bishop or patriarch, and it was with them that Muslim armies would negotiate the terms of the city's surrender. So in this world, an individual identified himself first and foremost as a Christian or a Jew, or later a Muslim, rather than a Roman. So most of the inhabitants of the Near East in the 7th century took their religion seriously. So I'm going to completely skip over the political and prophetic career of Muhammad and jump right into the listener's question about how Muslim armies were able to conquer the Near East. One of the many innovations that Muhammad brought to Arabia was that he largely, and not completely by any means, but to a significant degree, replaced tribal loyalty, which was the nexus of your identity in pre-Islamic Arabia, with religious loyalty. You're part of a religious community now instead of explicitly a tribal community. And that's significant because in pre-Islamic Arabia, tribal warfare and blood feuds among tribes was the order of the day. After the death of Muhammad, one of the biggest questions of the early Muslim community was whether tribes would be independent again, and would it be something like after the death of Attila the Hun, when his empire collapses almost immediately, and these tribes would practice the teachings that Muhammad taught them, but they would be completely independent, or would these tribes that united under Muhammad form a new state, kind of like the Mongolian Empire? After the death of Muhammad, the community elected a caliph. A caliph carried on the political functions of Muhammad, but not the religious ones, since Muhammad was conceived of as the final prophet. There were 4 caliphs that were universally, for the most part, recognized by the Muslim community, and then after the 4th, you have the split into the Sunni and Shia Muslims. These caliphs were elected by a council or chosen based on the wishes of their predecessor. And I mention the caliphs because it's during this period of the 4 caliphs that you see the most dramatic conquests by the Muslim Empire, or I'll call them the Caliphate now. The first was Abu Bakr. He ruled for 2 years, from 632 to 634. He was the father-in-law of Muhammad who consolidated the Muslim community. Immediately after Muhammad's death, many tribes, which had only nominally accepted Islam's authority, figured that they could break away and regain their independence. But Abu Bakr proclaimed a jihad against these, what he called them, apostates. And there was a series of wars known as the Ridda Wars, or apostasy wars. So it's interesting that apostasy wasn't simply to renounce your religion, but it was to renounce the authority of the state. So religion and the state were conceived of as one and the same in this period. According to some of the early sources, tens of thousands of Arabs were put to the sword until their tribes resubmitted to Islam. The second caliph was Umar. He was a companion and advisor to Muhammad, and he ruled from 634 to 644. Major conquests happened under his rule, and the caliphate conquers Persia and much of Byzantium. Uthman was the third caliph from 644 to 656. He was a companion of Muhammad. He was born into the Umayyad clan of Mecca, and he was very wealthy, and he appointed family members to important posts. He was assassinated by rebels in Medina. The texts of the Quran are compiled when he's caliph, and variant texts are destroyed. And also the fact that he was assassinated shows all the political infighting that's occurring at this stage. The final of the first 4 caliphs was Ali. He was a cousin of Muhammad, and he reigned during the first fitna, or civil war, in Islam. During this period, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was governor of Syria, and he founds the Umayyad dynasty after the end of the first Muslim civil war in 661. Syria remained the Umayyads' main power base, and Damascus was the capital. So from 661 to 750, the Umayyad dynasty represents the Muslim caliphate, and then from 750 onward, the Abbasids defeat them, and the Muslim caliphate is then centered in Baghdad. Okay, so that's all I wanted to discuss there. This question of leadership is crucial to the early Muslim conquests. The tribal factor continued to play an important role in the development of what would become the Islamic community. In the wake of Muhammad's death, the community was shaken by the Ridda Wars, when Abu Bakr fought against those tribes, which considered the tribal confederation suspended, and their allegiance to it terminated now that Muhammad was gone. The Sunni tradition casts this as a defining moment in Muslim history. The Muslims' victory is credited with both preserving one state and cementing the identification of Islam with the Arabs. But what's very important for our discussion on Muslim conquests was Umar's decision to allow tribes which had rebelled during the Ridda Wars to participate in the incursions into and the attacks on the Fertile Crescent. So they were going out of Arabia on the traditional Arab homeland and moving into the Fertile Crescent. So Umar's decision reincorporated defeated Arabs into the growing Muslim empire, but it also acknowledged the claims of the tribes, the rights of tribes to self-identification. So tribal identity was still important, even though there was now a religion that bound all these different people together. And these two weren't necessarily contradictory, and they could work hand in hand. Historians have given different explanations for the Arab conquests in the Near East in the 4th and 5th decades of the 7th century. Some have stressed factors peculiar to tribal Arabia, and others have credited it to the newfound religious fervor of the Arabs. But there's no reason there can't be multiple factors. The tribal factor played a huge role in the initial stages of Muslim history, and continued to do so for some time.